It is top of the hour, so thank you all for coming. I'm Patrick with Western Title. Today we are going to be talking about FIRPTA, which is financial investment in the United States real estate market. Our presenter today is Sylvia Smith. She is the president of Western Title. So for those of you who don't know or are new or unfamiliar with it, Western Title, we're a title and escrow company here in Northern Nevada. We've been around since 1902. We've got 7 different offices. We have 2 here in Reno. We have 1 in Fernley, Gardnerville, Urington, Fernley, all those places. We have a bunch of escrow officers who are more than happy to work with you guys and help you guys get going on your title and escrow needs. I am one of the sales guys, so I like to give you guys guides, good jokes, life advice from time to time. I'm really terrible at that, so just ignore the life advice. But on a completely educational moment, we host these types of classes for you guys about once a month. We like to get you guys lunch, have it sent to your guys' house. So hopefully everybody has their famous Daves sitting in front of them, except for Brad and Cassandra. So we'll fix that for next time. Next month, at the very end, we'll announce what we're doing next. But for today, we're going to pass it over to Sylvia, and she's going to be talking about FIRPTA. Given the density of the subject, we're going to ask you guys to hold your questions until the end. There's going to be a whole entire segment where you can ask all your questions. If you're afraid you're going to forget it, utilize the chat box. There's a little chat box at the very bottom where you can type in your questions, and we can address those at the very end. And on that happy note, any questions before we get started from anybody? Okay, all right. Well, Sylvia, I will turn it over to you. If you want to share your screen and the PowerPoint, you can take it away.
Yes, nod.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, yes. FIRPTA. It's a fun acronym. It's a very dry topic, so thank you for giving up your lunch hour today to learn about this. FIRPTA stands for the Foreign Investment in Real Property Act of 1980. My little disclaimer before we start is that this is basically a brief overview of what FIRPTA is, and I geared this really more toward you as the real estate agent and what you should be aware of. If we get too technical and too deep into a lot of the different tax issues, you really should talk to a CPA or legal counsel. So we're going to hit the basics, but again, I am not an attorney, just so we're all clear, or tax accountant. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, maybe. Okay, what is FIRPTA? The FIRPTA law was created to capture gains, taxes basically realized when a foreign person owns United States real property and they sell it and they gain a profit from owning that property. So the government enacted this tax in 1980. It was changed in 1985 and again in 2016. So what sales are covered by FIRPTA? Basically all of them. So if you have a transaction on US real estate, keep that in mind, that even if it's a seller carryback, if it's an exchange, if it's a foreclosure, a deed in lieu of foreclosure transaction, a short sale even, or any other transaction that's being handled where the seller would be deemed a foreign person that owns the property. And we're going to get into definitions of that here in just a minute. The biggest change is this law has been around obviously for a very, very long time. It was changed fairly dramatically as far as the amount in February of 2016 under the PATH Act, the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes of 2015. So how do you know if you have a sale that might fall under the FIRPTA guidelines? This is probably the biggest question. If you're the listing agent and you take a listing, ask your seller. It's a legal, it's an okay question to ask. I do believe, Daryl, and you could maybe tell me, last time I sat on the risk reduction committee, I do believe that the listing form asks if the seller is a foreign individual. Is that right?
Sylvia, I'd have to look. I know it's referenced in the purchase contract, but I'll have to look at the
Okay.
exclusive right to sell contract and get back to everybody.
Okay, so I know it was going to be in both. Where this really comes into play is if you represent the buyer, and we're going to get into that. So again, check the MLS, watch the purchase agreement, and above all, ask the listing agent if you see the seller's address that is a forwarding address in another country, click on that and just, you know, kind of see and know. The reason, and it matters if you're representing the buyer, is because the buyer or other transferee of a U.S. real property, the buyer is responsible to make sure that the appropriate amount of the withhold tax is held from the seller's proceeds and is paid to the IRS or U.S. Department of Treasury. I know this is usually where we get the big, well, why does the buyer care? And we on the escrow side get a lot of flack over that. And my big disclaimer is we didn't write the federal law. And that's the way it's written, is the buyer is the ultimate responsible person. And that's because the only thing the US government can attach for this tax is that real property. Because the seller obviously is left and is living in a foreign country, and the United States, the IRS is not going to pursue them. They're going to go after the property. So that's why this really is a huge issue for everyone to at least be aware of. So these are the definitions according to the IRS, and this will help kind of explain a few things. Transferee obviously is your buyer. Your transferor is the foreign person that is disposing of the United States real property by sale, exchange, gift, or other method of disposition. We talked about some of those: an installment sale, an exchange, short sale. A lot of people back in the day, the short sales were like, well, why does it matter? They have no proceeds. But again, it does matter to the federal government, and we have to deal with FIRPTA no matter what. A qualified substitute, and these definitions are from the IRS, is a person, including the title company, responsible for closing the transaction. Now, in some areas of the country, that could be an attorney, if it's a round table state. For us, it's generally always going to be your title and escrow company. The withholding agent is the buyer. They are the ones that are responsible to withhold, report, and transmit the funds to the IRS. A foreign person, this is where it defines the foreign person. It's a non-resident alien individual, even if they have a social security number, if they're a non-resident alien. If they're a resident alien, then they are not considered to be a foreign person. So I know this is probably not a politically correct term, but if they have a valid green card, they are a resident alien. If their green card is expired, they then are now considered a non-resident alien, so they would be subject to the FIRPTA tax. A foreign corporation that is not elected to be treated as a domestic corporation for tax purposes, a foreign partnership, a foreign trust, any kind of foreign estate. A U.S. corporation that is owned by a foreign corporation as its sole owner also would be considered a foreign person. The amount realized is going to be the sales price, and we're going to get into that when I review the percentages. So the FIRPTA, the amount of tax paid, is based on the purchase price, not their net proceeds. So that creates a lot of angst from time to time. And again, when the foreign person files their tax return, that if we've collected too much, then they can apply to get that refunded to them. But we don't know. It's like a same thing when we do the 1099 filing on every deal. When we have the seller fill it out, when they get their 1099 from us, they think, well, it should show my net proceeds. And it's like, no, it's based on the sales price. Your CPA, when you go to do your taxes, will deal with whatever that net gain really may be, but that's not for us to do. The data transfers, close of escrow. U.S. real property interest owned jointly by a foreign and a non-foreign transfer. The sales price will be allocated based on capital contribution. That's going to be more, you're going to see that more in a commercial type transaction where perhaps a U.S. corporation owns a portion and a foreign corporation owns another portion. The U.S. corporation is not subject to FIRPTA, but the foreign corporation is, and at that point, they would need to allocate that. If you have a husband and wife, the IRS, no matter what, will show it as 50% each. So say the husband is a US citizen and the wife may be a non-resident alien, we have to pay based on 50%. So in other words, they can't say, oh, well, I have zero interest, or I only have 25%. The IRS guideline, it is 50%. So the sales price is cut in half and it's paid on half if it's a husband and wife. So before we go further, I'll go ahead. Are there any questions so far before we get into amounts that I can answer for you now about what we just talked about?
Sylvia, it looks like we had a question in the chat from Michelle Foster. So the question reads, when my green card expired, they told me that my status as resident alien had not expired, only the document had expired. Do you have any clarification on that or anything in specific?
No, that would again probably be more of a CPA or a legal question. All the documentation and everything I reviewed to prep for this said that the green card needed to be it couldn't be expired. That would be a much deeper question.
All right, thank you. Anybody else have any questions that they didn't put in the chat? All right, so yeah, take it away.
Okay, now we're going to get into the dollar amounts. So these are the exceptions to having to pay FIRPTA. So you found out you're dealing with a foreign seller. If the purchase price is less, this is what changed, is this next portion on the dollar amount. So your sales price is less than $300,000 and the buyer intends to live in the property as their primary residence, it is exempt. However, we'll get into that a little bit more about the definition of that, and the buyer signing a document and agreeing to the information provided by the seller and the buyer intending to live there. So we'll get deeper into that here in just a second. So again, the buyer and seller both are required to sign an affidavit acknowledging the intended use. If the foreign seller provides the buyer with a withholding certificate from the IRS that indicates they have no FIRPTA tax obligation due, or they provide a certificate that has a lesser dollar amount, they certainly can do that. However, That process takes about 90 days through the IRS, and the seller has to initiate that. So if you are taking a listing and you've determined your seller would be considered a foreign seller, this can be suggested, but just know it's going to take some lead time with the IRS. And with COVID, I can tell you it's probably going to be more than 90 days. So, but it can be done. And your seller, in order to get that withholding certificate, would have to have a tax ID number. That's what an I-10 down below is. It's an individual tax ID number. It's a number issued by the IRS or Social Security Administration in lieu of a Social Security number. They fill out a form, the 8288B, and that process takes about 10 days for them just to get that taxpayer ID number. And again, if your buyer is the United States government or a state entity, then it's exempt from FIRPTA. So the amount due. If the property will not be used as your buyer's primary residence under the IRS guidelines, and I put that down below, buyer or a member of the buyer's immediate family has definitive plans to live in the property at least 50% of the year for the first 2 years of ownership. That's what the IRS considers buyer's primary residence. And they will sign an affidavit to that effect saying so that if the IRS comes back, and again, the buyer needs to make sure they understand the liability of FIRPTA being paid lies on them. So I wouldn't knowingly participate in something like that if your buyer's like, and the seller agree, oh, we're just gonna sign it, and it's really gonna be a rental. I'd be very careful. If the purchase price exceeds 300,000, oh, I'm sorry, let me finish up above. So if the property will not be used as the buyer's residence ever, and it's even if the purchase price is less than 300,000, 15% of the sales price is held and paid to the IRS. So again, this is if the buyer does not intend to live there. So even if the purchase price is 100,000, 15% of that goes to the U.S. Treasury out of the purchase. If the price exceeds 300,000 and is less than $1 million, and the property will be the buyer's residence, then the withhold rate goes to 10%. If the purchase price exceeds $1 million, the withhold rate is 15%, regardless of the use by the buyer, use or occupancy of the buyer. Any non-residential property, vacant land, commercial, any of that that's owned is flat at the withhold rate of 15% of the sales price. Whoops. And penalties. So failure to pay when due, the tax and interest can be collected against the buyer, and penalties of up to $10,000 if the failure to pay is willful. So that's what I was talking about. If they get together and say, oh, we'll just say I'm going to live there, and they give us a statement and the FERC does not pay, the federal government steps in for whatever reason, it can be up to 10 grand on the penalty. So now what for you, now that you're all speechless with this? Determine early if your seller is considered a foreign person. It's like I said before, you can ask the question. There is no, when I sat on the risk reduction, there was always a feeling of, oh, we're crossing a line if we ask our seller that question. And actually you're not, because the buyer is now liable under the FIRPTA law to be held accountable for that. And trust me, if it's not dealt with, you'll be their first call, and then we'll probably be your first call after that. So if in doubt, ask. And if you're have the buyer and you look at the seller's name and you just want to know, ask the listing agent. It's okay. The seller can also, if there's ever a doubt, you can ask the seller to provide a FIRPTA certification or affidavit. And that's a document that, hold on, I had it right here, where the seller attests to the buyer that they have their, I'm gonna just hold this up for now, but we'll get, oh, you can't see it. We'll get copies to you, but it's basically where the seller is testifying or attesting that they are not a foreign seller, and they're providing their taxpayer ID number, their address, and then it's signed by the seller as an individual or their entity. The other thing to find out is ask if your escrow agent will act as the substituted agent. Just so everyone understands, we are not required by law to act in that capacity. It can be the buyer's or seller's CPA. There's actually a couple companies that handle FIRPTA for people, that if you ever get in that situation, we can get you that information. You need to make sure that the buyer understands, this is where FIRPTA gets confusing and super tricky, is that while the funds may be withheld from the seller's proceeds, all the documentation that we have to complete and send with the money is sent under your buyer's social security number. So it is a big deal. It creates a lot of confusion for the buyer. And we really recommend at any time, and you should too, that if you have a buyer and you know the seller is a foreign person or entity, make sure they're at least talking to their CPA or tax advisor, because they're gonna be asked to complete a whole bunch of forms if we agree to handle the payment of the funds. Everybody's going to be signing agreements. There's like probably 5 different IRS forms that the buyer and seller both complete, but all of this gets paid, it's seller's money, but it's paid under your buyer's social security number, and they will receive documentation back from the IRS acknowledging it, that they will need to take to their CPA, just so everyone has record of it. So that's probably the biggest thing that we see. You know, we get down to it, it's all great, but then we start asking the buyer, hey, you've got to complete all these forms, and it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of I don't know, I guess just unrest for the buyer, because they're maybe haven't been made aware of FIRPTA, and they don't know what they're supposed to do, and why am I liable, and why do they need my social security number. Basically, it's because ultimately the buyer is responsible for this tax in the IRS eyes. Forms and more forms.
Before you move on, we did have a couple questions on that.
Okay.
So the very first one was from Daryl. He said, is this to capture a tax from a foreign investor who may not have been paying while owning the subject property?
You cut out, Patrick. Say that again.
Oh, sorry about that. So Daryl's question was, on the previous slide, is this to capture a tax from a foreign investor who may not have been paying while owning subject property?
It's the IRS's way of making sure that they get their gains tax if it's due. That's why if they really are insistent they don't owe the US government money on the gain, then they should go through that withholding certification process. But yes, ultimately the purpose of the tax is so the IRS isn't tracking down a foreign seller and why they attach it to the property.
All right. And another question we had was, what happens if there are not enough funds from foreign sellers' proceeds to pay the IRS in the sale?
Well, that's a really good question. We ran into that a lot on the short sales, and basically we have to submit the documentation. Everything was put on hold and needed to be submitted to the IRS. Have any of you closed a transaction where the seller might have an IRS lien? They're a US person, they have an IRS lien, but there isn't enough money to pay it in full. There is a process that they have to go through directly with the IRS to get a certificate that releases, where they say they'll take whatever proceeds and they'll release the lien for it. And FIRPTA is a very similar process.
All right. Well, that's all the questions we've got for now. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. We're getting close here. So forms and more forms. So like I talked about, the buyer and seller will complete an IRS form 80 to 88, 80 to 88, A, B, and C, and 8821. Any of the forms that are required if the seller or buyer, for that matter, does not have a tax ID number, social security number. There's also a W-7. There's a W-8 BEN form that needs to be filled out. All of these forms and the funds need to be submitted to the IRS and payment within 20 days of the close of escrow. So that circles back, because generally the next question we get, like to follow up with where Daryl was going or anyone else, would we close an escrow and wait for the seller to go and do this certificate? Generally, no, we can't, because if we're bound, if we agree to be the substituted agent and go ahead and be the one to handle the paperwork and pay the funds, then the penalty then comes back on us if we're not able to pay it within the 20 days. If the seller doesn't want to get their taxpayer ID number, they certainly can agree to not do that, but then we pay that money to the IRS and we're going to put right on their ANA. And all I can say to the seller is good luck if you file a return and, you know, try to deal with this. Western prefers that we at least have a I-10 individual tax ID number. It just makes sense for the person to have it. Your buyer generally is going to have a social security number, so they're going to be covered. But with the seller, it's just difficult if they don't at least apply and get that I-10. It's very hard. So all the forms are available at irs.org. If you really want to have some late night, incredibly boring reading, you can actually pull down all the instructions for 80 to 88, those forms I talked about in there that we'll go over. Again, like I said, this was a very brief overview of a very complicated tax issue. Your biggest takeaway, hopefully for you, is find out early and let your favorite escrow officer know, because if we're dealing with a FIRPTA tax payment, we need to know early, because there's a whole lot of work that has to go into getting those forms, explaining it. It should be, if you're the listing agent and you know, it really should be disclosed to the buyer's agent so they're at least aware and can get whatever advice they think they might you know, want to get, because again, everything is filed under the buyer. And no, we won't hold the money while the seller works with the IRS. So I think that was it for me. Is there any questions, anything you want to delve a little bit deeper into?
Yeah, this is Bob Hoyen.
Hi.
Go ahead, Bob.
Hi there. Hey, I looked at the exclusive right to sell contract just a couple of minutes ago. I don't see any reference to FIRPTA in there. So the only reference that we're accustomed to seeing is on page 10 of the offer and acceptance. Then you talk about the responsibility of the buyer on this, but it makes sense to me that there be something in the listing agreement that there's an acknowledgement, one, that the seller meets this foreign requirement, and two, that in my mind, the seller is or the listing agent or the seller is obligated to advise the buyer early on in the process, because I've questioned it before. I mean, you could see a John and Jane Smith, and if you don't ask the question as the buyer agent, you could have all kinds of engagements with the listing agent. I mean, you see what you might consider a typical U.S. name, but it could be Canadian, it could be British.
Right.
And it just makes sense to me that the earlier portion of this process, the better that's known.
I concur 100%.
Hey, Sylvia, this is Daryl. Bob, thank you for looking. I did not have access right now to that exclusive right to sell contract. What I can do is confirm what Bob just said, which I believe to be true if he just looked, and I'll submit it to April, of the CEO of RSAR, to get to their risk reduction committee, because this is the time that they get ready for any updates to their approved forms, because they release them first of the year. So I'll see if that's ever been discussed, and I certainly think it's of value, so thanks.
Yeah, I've been on that committee. I did not do it this year for probably 20 plus years, and I know the conversation has come up a lot. I thought they had put on there, Daryl, but obviously I'm totally wrong on that, because we discussed that in great detail. It should be asked at the time of listing, even just for you as the listing agent and you, Daryl, as broker, to know, hey, we have to deal with this. It's not something that can't be dealt with. It can, it's just a process. But if no one knows until the very end, that's when it creates issues for sure. Any other questions?
We have a couple questions in the chat. One of the questions was, do we know what % of Western Title closings have FIRPTA involved? I do not know that off the top of my head. That's definitely something that we can look into, and we'd be able to get back to you guys and get you guys a better number. Do you have any feedback on that?
To be honest, it probably, because they have to get me involved if we have a FIRPTA, because the liability is so serious on our end if we opt to act as the substituted agent for the buyer. We probably only have about 4 or 5 a year. They kind of seem to go in spurts. In a market like now, there isn't like a lot of foreign investors, but back in, 09, 10, when you could buy home short sales, and, we would see a lot of foreign buyers. So yes, I could see that increasing as our values go up and people wanting to sell.
Sylvia, this is Daryl again. I put in the chat to Patrick right when you were saying that. I guessed 1%. If I've dealt with it, because agents would come to me if they have it, because they go, what the heck is this? I have probably had 2 or 3 in 25 years say, what the heck is this?
Right.
When it first happened, it was years into the business for me. And I went, I don't know, let's ask Sylvia. And that started the Western Title launch of what is FIRPTA X years ago. So that's really how this all started, that all of you are now maybe in your first session with Sylvia. It started with one of you coming to me saying, what is FIRPTA? And Western started to deliver this class, if you will, this instruction. To Patrick, if you don't mind, I'll address one of our agents' questions. We've maintained this FIRPTA material on our Agent Care Center for some time. We will take the current presentation, this visual, we'll upload it as well to the Weekly Wire, this recorded session, because it is being recorded. It will be in the Weekly Wire and archived to our Agent Care Center. So all of you have access to it, and those that miss this will have access to this.
And Daryl, I'm going to, I have a kind of a simpler chart, I guess, for lack of a better word, on the percentages that I will, Patrick and I will work on and get that over to you so you could email it out to your agents just so they have the percentages of the sales price. And if you like, we can also get you a FIRPTA certification form, just so you know what it looks like, a blank one.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Can share those too. Okay. Well, thanks for letting me address all of you on this exciting topic of FIRPTA, but it is a good one to know. It does come up, and when it does, it's great that you can at least say, you know what, I don't totally remember all that, except I know enough to call Western or get with Daryl and have Daryl call me and we'll walk through it together. So.
Excellent. All right. Well, hey, thank you, Sylvia. I really appreciate it. I know we like to overload some of you people with just as much knowledge as we can get. So I hope nobody's brain exploded today. Like Sylvia said, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me on the sales side. Sylvia's contact info is right there on the main page, so you can see the direct line as well as her email. So feel free to reach out to us. Like I mentioned to you guys, we have another class coming up next month. It's going to be January 14th. Yes, Thursday, January 14th, same time. So it's going to be from noon until 1, and we're going to be going over escrow horror stories. So we'll be having an escrow officer talking about some of the things that you need to know about how to open an escrow, what happens in the middle, and what to expect at the end. We're going to be going over some forms, what to expect, what numbers to look for that are important for you guys. So we'll be sending out the contact, all the details about that class here in a little bit. But thank you again for attending, and we hope everybody on here has a very Merry Christmas, whether you're with family or you're just sticking around your own house. And again, if you have any questions, you can always give us a call, and we'll see you guys at the next class.
Thanks for spending your lunch hour.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, Patrick, and all of our agents. Appreciate your time to be with us on this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you guys again.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.
Patrick, I'm emailing it right now.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Nice to meet you, Patrick.
Nice to meet you too, Cassandra. Have a great day.
You too.